September, 9 AD. 20,000 Roman soldiers, 3 entire legions, marching through a dense Germanic forest. These aren't just any soldiers. They're the most feared military force on earth, the iron fist of an empire that spans from Britain to Mesopotamia. Their commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, rides at the front. He's already dreaming of his triumph in Rome, of the gold and glory waiting for him. He's pacified Germania, or so he thinks. Within 3 days, every single one of these soldiers will be dead. Their eagles, the sacred standards of Rome, will be captured. Their commander will fall on his own sword. And in Rome, the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Augustus, will wander his palace at night, banging his head against the marble walls, screaming, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." This is the story of the Teutoburg forest disaster, the battle that changed the course of Western civilization, the ambush that proved Rome could bleed, the betrayal that haunted an empire for generations. And it all started with one man's arrogance and another man's revenge. To understand how catastrophic this defeat was, you first need to understand what Rome represented in 9 AD. Rome wasn't just powerful, it was inevitable. For centuries, its legions had marched across the known world, crushing every enemy that dared to resist. Gauls, Carthaginians, Greeks, Egyptians, all had fallen before the Roman war machine. The Roman military wasn't just an army. It was a system of controlled violence perfected over generations. Every legion was a self-contained fighting unit of roughly 5,000 men, supported by auxiliary troops. These soldiers weren't barbarian warriors fighting for glory or tribal honor. They were professionals, trained, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. They built roads as they marched. They constructed fortified camps every single night, even after exhausting marches. They moved in formation, fought in formation, and died in formation. Where other armies saw chaos and confusion in battle, Romans saw geometry and engineering problems to be solved. And their equipment? Legendary. The gladius, the short sword designed for the brutal close-quarters combat Rome specialized in. The scutum, the rectangular shield that turned individual soldiers into an impenetrable wall. The pilum, the javelin engineered to bend on impact, making it impossible for enemies to throw back. But perhaps Rome's greatest weapon was psychological. When you saw the Roman eagles cresting the horizon, you knew what was coming. Resistance was futile. Submit, pay tribute, and you might be allowed to keep your land and your life. Resist, and your city would be reduced to ash, your people sold into slavery, your very existence erased from history. By 9 AD, Rome controlled virtually all of Europe south and west of the Rhine and Danube rivers. The Mediterranean was literally called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Nobody could challenge Roman supremacy. Nobody, except the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine. The Germans were different from other peoples Rome had conquered. They weren't civilized city dwellers who could be bought off with Roman luxuries and political positions. They were tribal warriors living in dense forests, marshes, and hostile terrain that seemed designed to thwart Roman military tactics. Caesar had crossed the Rhine briefly in 55 and 53 BC, more as a publicity stunt than a real invasion. But he'd described the Germans as fierce, primitive barbarians who knew nothing of Roman civilization. They lived in crude settlements, had no proper cities, and worshipped strange gods in sacred forest groves. But they were tough, dangerously tough. They could march for days through terrain that would kill Roman soldiers. They knew every path, every bog, every hidden ravine in their homeland. And they were fierce fighters, tall, strong, and fearless in battle. Emperor Augustus,
who had transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, had a vision: push Rome's border from the Rhine River to the Elbe River, effectively creating a shorter, more defensible frontier and bringing all of Germania under Roman control. It seemed achievable. Several successful campaigns had been conducted. Roman forts were being established east of the Rhine. German tribes were being played against each other, as Rome had done successfully for centuries in other regions. And that's where our story's villain enters: Publius Quinctilius Varus. Enter Varus, arrogance personified. Publius Quinctilius Varus was everything wrong with late Republic and early Empire Roman aristocracy wrapped into one pompous package. He was born into privilege, married into more privilege by wedding Augustus's great-auntie, and had been handed governorships he'd done nothing to earn. His previous posting was in Syria, one of Rome's richest provinces, where he'd allegedly enriched himself through taxation and corruption. The Roman historian Velleius Paterculus, who actually served in Germania and knew Varus, described him as a man of mild character and quiet disposition, somewhat slow in mind as he was in body, and more accustomed to the leisure of the camp than to actual service in war. Translation: Varus was lazy, soft, and completely unprepared for what Germania would throw at him. But here's the thing: Varus didn't see Germania as a military challenge. He saw it as a nearly conquered province that just needed proper Roman administration. He brought Roman law to tribes who had no concept of written law. He held court sessions in the middle of military camps. He tried to levy Roman taxes on people who had never paid taxes. Varus treated Germania like it was Syria or Gaul, settled, pacified, ready to be milked for revenue. He surrounded himself with German tribal leaders who seemed friendly to Rome, who spoke Latin, who wore Roman clothes and adopted Roman customs. One of these trusted German advisors was a young man named Arminius. And that's where Varus made his fatal mistake. Arminius, born around 18 BC, the son of a chieftain of the Cherusci tribe. But his childhood was not spent in Germanic forests. It was spent in Rome. As part of Rome's standard practice of cultural imperialism, promising young men from conquered or allied tribes were brought to Rome as hostages, although Rome preferred the term guests. These weren't prisoners in dungeons. They were being educated, civilized, turned into Romans who would then return to their homelands and govern on Rome's behalf. Arminius received a Roman education. He learned Latin and Greek. He studied Roman history, philosophy, and military tactics. He was granted Roman citizenship and even elevated to equestrian rank, the second tier of Roman nobility. More importantly, he served in the Roman military. He commanded auxiliary troops, learned Roman battle tactics from the inside, and earned the trust of Roman commanders. By all accounts, he was an excellent soldier and leader. When he returned to Germania, he was exactly what Rome wanted: a Romanized German who could serve as an intermediary between the empire and his people. Varus trusted him completely. Arminius served as one of Varus's closest advisors and companions. But beneath the Roman exterior, something else was burning: the seeds of betrayal. We don't know exactly when Arminius decided to betray Rome. Ancient sources suggest different motivations. Some say it was always his plan, that even as a young man in Rome, he was studying his enemy, learning his weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Others suggest it was more personal. Perhaps he was denied a position he thought he deserved. Perhaps he witnessed Roman atrocities against his people. Perhaps he simply realized that Rome would never see him as truly Roman, no matter how perfectly he played the part. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing a century later, described Arminius as the liberator of Germany, who challenged Rome not in her infancy as other kings and generals, but at the height of her power. What we do know is that by 9 AD, Arminius had made his decision. He would destroy Varus and his legions. He would drive Rome back across the Rhine permanently. He would become the nightmare that emperors whispered about in the dark. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies. Uniting Germanic tribes was like herding cats made of lightning and violence. These weren't a unified nation. They were dozens of different tribes who spent as much time fighting each other than fighting Rome. But Arminius was charismatic, persuasive, and he had something powerful on his side: hatred of Rome.
He traveled in secret, meeting with chieftains. He reminded them of Roman arrogance, Roman taxation, Roman law being imposed on free German warriors. He painted a picture of what Germania would become under Rome, their children speaking Latin, their sacred groves cut down for Roman temples, their warrior culture replaced with Roman bureaucracy. And he offered them something irresistible: a chance to destroy 3 Roman legions in a single blow, a victory so complete, so overwhelming, that Rome would never dare return. The conspiracy included the Cherusei, Marsi, Chatti, Bructeri, and other tribes. Thousands of warriors, all coordinated in secret while pretending to remain loyal to Rome. It was a staggering feat of deception. For months, these tribal leaders met with Varus, smiled, accepted Roman gifts, attended Roman councils, all while planning the greatest ambush in ancient history. One German chieftain, Segestes, actually tried to warn Varus. He'd learned of the plot and, whether out of genuine loyalty to Rome or hatred of Arminius, who had allegedly stolen his daughter, he told Varus that Arminius was planning treason. Varus laughed it off. He trusted Arminius completely. After all, Arminius was Roman-educated, Roman-trained, a Roman citizen. The idea that he would betray Rome was absurd. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the magnitude of Varus's miscalculation. He had multiple warnings. Segestes wasn't the only one who expressed concerns. But Varus's arrogance, his absolute certainty that Rome was inevitable, that no civilized person would choose barbarism over Roman culture, blinded him completely. In late summer of 9 AD, Varus was stationed with his 3 legions, legions 17, 18, and 19, at a summer camp somewhere in the Weser River region. These weren't just combat troops. The legions had been in Germania for years, and many soldiers had brought their families, servants, and camp followers. The column included thousands of non-combatants. Varus was preparing to march back to winter quarters west of the Rhine when Arminius came to him with urgent news. A rebellion had broken out among a tribe to the north. It wasn't a major threat, but it needed to be dealt with quickly before winter made military operations impossible. Arminius volunteered to guide Varus and his legions to deal with this rebellion. The route would take them through the Teutoburg forest, but Arminius assured Varus it was safe. He'd traveled it many times. What Arminius didn't mention was that there was no rebellion. It was a fiction, carefully crafted to lure Varus into a killing ground. Varus took the bait. Why wouldn't he? Arminius was trustworthy. The route made sense, and crushing a minor rebellion would be good for Roman prestige before winter. On September 9th, 9 AD, 3 Roman legions, approximately 20,000 soldiers, plus thousands of camp followers and non-combatants, marched into the Teutoburg forest. They would never march out. Imagine you're a Roman legionary marching into that forest. You've been in Germania for years. You've seen combat, but nothing serious. Mostly it's been garrison duty, building forts, occasionally chasing down small bands of raiders.
You're looking forward to getting back to winter quarters. Maybe you'll see your family again if you've been granted leave. Maybe you'll just enjoy some downtime, some warm food, some wine. The weather is terrible. It's been raining for days. The trail, barely a trail really, is turning into a muddy nightmare. Your armor weighs you down. Your shield feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. But you're not worried. You're a Roman soldier. You've marched through worse. And your commander, Varus, seems confident. His trusted German guide, Arminius, is leading the way. What you don't know is that Arminius slipped away during the night. He's no longer with the column. He's with thousands of German warriors painted for war, watching your legion from the trees. The Teutoburg forest, or more accurately the Kalkriese area where modern archaeology has pinpointed the battle, was deliberately chosen. This wasn't random. Arminius knew exactly what kind of terrain would neutralize every Roman advantage. The route forced the Roman column to stretch out. Instead of marching in their usual compact formation, the legions were strung out over miles. Forest on one side, marshy ground on the other. The column became fragmented, separated into isolated units that couldn't support each other. Roman military doctrine was based on formation fighting, tight lines, coordinated movements, mutual support. In open terrain, a Roman legion was practically invincible, but stretched out in single file on a muddy forest trail, they were vulnerable. The rain kept falling. Visibility dropped. Communication between different parts of the column became nearly impossible. And then the attacks began. It started with small raids, Germanic warriors emerging from the forest, throwing javelins, then disappearing before the Romans could respond. Hit-and-run attacks designed to wound, to slow the column, to spread panic. Roman discipline held. These soldiers were professionals. They'd trained for this. They formed defensive positions, shields up, waiting for orders. But the Germans weren't attacking to win, not yet. They were herding the Romans, pushing them deeper into the trap, using the terrain like a weapon. Varus finally realized something was wrong. This wasn't a few raiders. This was organized, coordinated. There were thousands of Germans in those woods. He tried to establish a fortified camp for the night, following standard Roman procedure, but the terrain made it almost impossible. They managed to construct some basic defenses, but nothing like the proper Roman camps that could withstand a siege. That night must have been horrific. Rain pouring down, wounded men screaming, no proper walls, and in the darkness they could hear the Germans chanting, beating drums, making noise designed to terrify. Some soldiers probably thought they'd push through the next day, reach open ground, turn and fight properly, show these barbarians what Roman steel could do. They had no idea how bad it was going to get.
The third day was when it all fell apart. The Germans launched a massive, coordinated assault. Thousands of warriors hitting the Roman column from all sides. This wasn't skirmishing anymore. This was a battle for annihilation. The Romans tried to fight back. They formed shield walls where they could. Centurions screamed themselves hoarse, trying to maintain discipline. Individual soldiers performed acts of incredible bravery. But they were outnumbered, surrounded, and fighting in terrain that nullified everything that made them effective. The tight formations that made Roman infantry unstoppable in open battle, impossible in the forest. The mutual support between different units. The column was too spread out. The cavalry that could have scouted, harried, or broken up German attacks, useless in the mud and woods. Archaeological evidence from Kalkriese paints a vivid picture. Thousands of artifacts, Roman coins, armor pieces, weapons, even skeletal remains, all tell the same story. This is where Romans died in massive numbers. Some tried to surrender. The Germans weren't interested. This wasn't about taking prisoners or ransom. This was about sending a message.
As the battle reached its climax, Varus knew it was over. Thousands of his men were dead, were dying. The eagles, the sacred standards that represented the legion's honor, were being captured by the Germans. In Roman culture, losing your legion's eagle was the ultimate disgrace. Legions that lost their eagles were sometimes disbanded in shame. The eagle wasn't just a symbol, it was the legion's soul. Varus made his final decision. Rather than face capture, humiliation, and the certain death that awaited him in German hands, he committed suicide. The accounts vary on details, but most sources agree he fell on his sword, assisted by his aides. Even in death, he wasn't granted dignity. The Germans found his body, beheaded him, and sent his head to other tribes as proof of their victory. His officers who survived him also chose suicide rather than surrender. It was considered the honorable Roman way, death before dishonor. By the end of the third day, 3 entire Roman legions had been destroyed. 20,000 soldiers, plus thousands of civilians, were dead. A handful of survivors managed to escape and make it back to Roman territory, bringing news of the disaster. The Germans celebrated by performing ritual sacrifices. Archaeological evidence suggests they dragged captured Romans to sacred groves and executed them as offerings to their gods. Equipment was ritually destroyed and buried. The battlefield became a sacred site of German victory. For weeks after, the forest was a scene of horror. Bodies everywhere, picked apart by scavengers. Roman equipment scattered and looted. The trail marked by the debris of a destroyed army. The Germans had achieved something thought impossible. They'd destroyed 3 Roman legions in a single battle. And they'd captured the eagles, those sacred standards that represented Roman power and pride. Rome had been humiliated in a way it hadn't experienced in generations. When news reached Rome, the reaction was seismic. Emperor Augustus, the man who transformed Rome from a republic torn by civil war into a stable empire, was devastated. Ancient sources describe him wandering the palace in shock, letting his hair and beard grow unkempt for months in mourning. And according to the historian Suetonius, Augustus would sometimes bang his head against the palace walls, crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Think about that image. The most powerful man in the world reduced to that. It wasn't just grief, it was existential terror. For the first time in generations, Rome looked vulnerable. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Romans had grown up believing their empire was invincible, that their legions couldn't be defeated by barbarians. Teutoburg shattered that myth. Legions 17, 18, and 19 were never reformed. Their numbers were essentially cursed, removed from the sequence. It would be like the United States Army permanently retiring divisions that suffered catastrophic defeats. It was Rome's way of acknowledging that this loss was different, permanent, shameful, and devastating. The Teutoburg forest disaster didn't just cost Rome 3 legions, it cost them Germania. All those years of campaigns, all those forts and settlements east of the Rhine, all those treaties with Germanic tribes, gone. The survivors fled back across the Rhine, forts were abandoned. Roman civilians who'd settled in Germania were killed or fled. Augustus's vision of a Roman Germania extending to the Elbe River died with Varus in those woods. The Rhine River became Rome's permanent frontier in the north. The empire that seemed unstoppable suddenly had clear limits. There was a line Rome couldn't cross, defended by forests and warriors who'd proven they could beat Roman legions. This had massive historical implications. If Rome had successfully conquered Germania, all of European history would be different. German tribes would have been Romanized like the Gauls. Christianity might have spread east more easily. The medieval period would have looked completely different. Instead, Germania remained outside Roman control, developing its own distinct culture and tribal structure that would eventually contribute to Rome's fall centuries later. But Rome didn't just accept defeat. Romans were many things, but they weren't quitters. The Teutoburg disaster became something Romans obsessed over, a wound to national pride that demanded vengeance. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and eventual successor, launched multiple campaigns into Germania. These weren't wars of conquest anymore. They were punitive expeditions designed to punish the Germans and recover some measure of honor. In 14 to 16 AD, Germanicus, one of Rome's most talented generals, led several major campaigns. He was specifically tasked with recovering the lost eagles and punishing the tribes involved in Varus's destruction. And he did find the battlefield. 6 years after the massacre, Roman soldiers walked through the Teutoburg forest and saw the remains of their comrades. The historian Tacitus, based on eyewitness accounts, described what they found: bones scattered everywhere, skulls mounted on tree trunks, altars where Germans had sacrificed Roman prisoners, Roman equipment, armor, and weapons rusting and half buried. The entire forest was a mass grave and a monument to Roman humiliation. Germanicus ordered his soldiers to bury the remains and conducted funeral rites. It was an attempt at closure, at giving the dead the proper Roman burial they'd been denied. But it couldn't erase what had happened. Germanicus did manage to recover 2 of the 3 lost eagles. Legions 17 and 18 standards were recaptured through military action. It was a propaganda victory, something Rome desperately needed. He also achieved some tactical victories, burning German villages and defeating Arminius in a few engagements. But he couldn't destroy Arminius or break German resistance. Ultimately, Emperor Tiberius recalled Germanicus. The campaigns were too expensive, the results too limited. Rome officially abandoned any plans to permanently conquer Germania. The third eagle, from Legion 19, was never recovered. Some sources suggest it was found decades later, but the exact fate remains unclear. Its loss remained a symbol of Rome's incomplete revenge. So what happened to Arminius, the man who defeated Rome? Ironically, he wasn't killed by Romans. His own success became his downfall. After defeating Varus, he tried to unite the Germanic tribes under his leadership. He'd proven he could beat Rome. He envisioned himself as a king, ruling a unified Germania. But the same tribal independence and distrust that made Germans hard for Rome to conquer also made them impossible for Arminius to unite. Other chieftains saw him as power-hungry. His own father-in-law, Segestus, the man who'd tried to warn Varus, remained loyal to Rome and fought against him. In 21 AD, 12 years after his great victory, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own tribe. The sources are vague on details, but it seems rivals feared his growing power and ambition. He was about 37 years old. He's said to be one to accept kingship, but one who would prefer death to Roman chains. Roman historians even respected him in death.
Tacitus, writing decades later, gave Arminius a remarkable epitaph. Unquestionably the liberator of Germany, one who had challenged Rome not in her infancy, but at the height of her power. A man who had known vicissitudes in warfare, but who had remained unconquered in war. From a Roman perspective, that's an incredible tribute. Tacitus, a Roman writing for a Roman audience, acknowledged that Arminius was a genuine hero and a formidable enemy who'd achieved something remarkable. For centuries, the exact location of the Teutoburg Forest battle was lost to history. Historians debated where it actually happened. Some thought it was in the Teutoburg Forest proper. Others suggested different locations. Then, in 1987, a British military officer and amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun, stationed in Germany,
started using a metal detector near Kalkreis, a town in Lower Saxony. What he found changed everything. Thousands of Roman coins, all dating to the Augustan period. Pieces of Roman military equipment, sling stones, fragments of armor, and most tellingly, clear evidence of defensive earthworks that matched descriptions of the battle. Subsequent professional archaeological excavations confirmed it. This was the site of the Teutoburg disaster. The discoveries at Kalkreis are remarkable. We're talking about over 6,000 Roman and Germanic artifacts. The distribution tells a story. Roman equipment concentrated in areas where the column was attacked, defensive positions where Romans tried to make a stand, areas where Germans performed ritual sacrifices afterward. One particularly haunting find, an iron face mask from a Roman cavalry helmet, battered and destroyed, found in a bog where it had been ritually deposited. You can see it in museums today, a face from 2,000 years ago, witness to one of history's most catastrophic battles. The site at Kalkreis has become a museum and memorial. You can walk the same ground where 20,000 Romans died. Archaeological work continues and new discoveries are still being made. The myth of Arminius in German history. Here's where the story gets complicated and a bit uncomfortable. Arminius became a legendary figure in German history, but not always in ways that reflect historical accuracy. In the centuries after his death, he was largely forgotten. Medieval Germans didn't particularly care about him. The various Germanic tribes had long since been Christianized and integrated into different kingdoms and political systems. Then, in the Renaissance, when classical texts were rediscovered, German intellectuals found Tacitus's accounts of Arminius. Suddenly, here was a German hero who defeated Rome. As German nationalism developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, Arminius, now called Hermann in German, became a symbol of German resistance to foreign domination. A massive monument was built between 1838 and 1875, the Hermannsdenkmal, or Hermann Monument, in the Teutoburg forest. It's a huge statue of Arminius holding a sword, pointing toward France. The symbolism was clear, Germans celebrating their ancient resistance to Rome, but also making a point about contemporary resistance to French influence. During the nationalist and Nazi periods of German history, Arminius was used as propaganda, a symbol of racial purity and Germanic superiority. This is, of course, completely ahistorical. Arminius was educated in Rome, fought for Rome, and wore Roman culture like a second skin. The idea that he represented some kind of pure Germanic nationalism is nonsense. Modern German historians and the public are much more nuanced about Arminius. He's recognized as a historical figure of genuine importance, but also as someone whose legacy has been distorted and misused. What Teutoburg meant for Rome. The Teutoburg disaster marked a turning point in Roman imperial strategy. Before 9 AD, Rome was still in expansion mode, still believed it could conquer the world. After 9 AD, Rome became defensive. The empire had reached its limits. Future emperors would make the occasional conquest, Britain under Claudius, Dacia under Trajan. But the fundamental mindset changed. The empire focused on defending and consolidating what it had rather than endless expansion. The Rhine-Danube frontier became a hard border defended by massive fortifications and permanent legionary bases. The famous limes, the fortified boundary of the Roman Empire, was a direct consequence of Teutoburg. Rome learned it couldn't conquer everyone, so it needed to defend its borders. This defensive mindset would eventually contribute to Rome's long, slow decline. An empire that stops expanding starts dying. The military that was designed for conquest found itself stuck in garrison duty. The economy that depended on plunder and conquest had to adjust. The cultural confidence that came from constant victory eroded. In a very real sense, the Roman Empire's eventual fall centuries later can be traced back in part to that forest in 9 AD. Lessons from the forest. What can we learn from the Teutoburg disaster? Beyond the specific historical details, there are universal themes here. First, arrogance is dangerous. Varus's complete confidence in Roman superiority, his inability to imagine that civilized Arminius could betray him, his dismissal of warnings, all of these came from arrogance. He couldn't conceive of a world where Rome could lose, so he didn't prepare for that possibility. Second, cultural imperialism has limits. Rome's strategy of co-opting local elites, educating them in Roman ways, and using them as intermediaries worked in many places. But it assumed that everyone wanted to be Roman, that Roman culture was so obviously superior that anyone exposed to it would embrace it. Arminius proved that assumption false. He took Rome's education, learned Rome's tactics, and used all of it against Rome. Third, terrain matters. The most sophisticated military in the world was defeated by warriors who knew their homeland. Rome's legions were unstoppable in open terrain. In the forest, they were helpless. The Germans understood this and chose their battlefield accordingly. Fourth, intelligence and adaptability win wars. Arminius showed remarkable intelligence, strategic, tactical, and political. He united disparate tribes for a specific goal. He manipulated Varus perfectly. He chose terrain that nullified Roman advantages and maximized Germanic strengths. He demonstrated that civilized and intelligent are not synonymous. The haunted forest. Even today, the Teutoburg forest has a reputation. Local legends speak of ghosts, Roman soldiers still marching through the woods, doomed to repeat their final march forever. Of course, these are just legends, but there's something compelling about the idea that such a traumatic event would leave an imprint on the place where it happened. The forest itself is beautiful, dense, green, peaceful. It's hard to imagine the horror that unfolded there 2,000 years ago. But if you visit the archaeological site at Coch if you stand where those earthworks were constructed specifically to funnel Roman soldiers into killing zones, if you see the actual artifacts in the museum, coins a soldier might have been carrying when he died, the bent point of a javelin that killed someone, the reality becomes tangible. 20,000 people died violently in those woods over 3 days. That's a scale of human suffering that's hard to comprehend. The Teutoburg forest disaster reminds us that history isn't inevitable. Rome seemed unstoppable. It controlled the known world. Its legions were legendary. And then, in 3 days, 20,000 soldiers were slaughtered by barbarians in a forest. One man's arrogance met another man's determination. Roman confidence met Germanic desperation. The world's most sophisticated military met terrain it couldn't handle and tactics it couldn't counter. The consequences echoed through centuries. Rome never conquered Germania. The Rhine remained a frontier. The empire learned it had limits, and those limits would eventually contribute to Rome's slow decline and fall.
Emperor Augustus's cry, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions," became one of the most famous laments in history. It wasn't just about 3 lost legions. It was about lost invincibility, lost destiny, the recognition that Rome could be defeated. Arminius proved that empires can bleed, that the inevitable can be stopped, that intelligence, determination, and perfect planning can overcome superior numbers and equipment. The forest that swallowed 3 Roman legions became a symbol of Roman hubris, of Germanic resistance, of the limits of imperial power. Even today, when we talk about military disasters, ambushes, or the dangers of overconfidence, the Teutoburg forest comes up. It's a battle that happened over 2,000 years ago in a forest in Germania, fought between people long dead and empires long fallen. But its lessons remain relevant. Power isn't permanent. Confidence without competence
is dangerous, and sometimes the course of history can change in 3 terrible days in a haunted forest.